So I don't think it's correct what Timothy Maudlin says about Aristotelian time, which he identifies with the supposed ordinary sense of time, which he says indifferently about ancient Athens and about modern America, because he thinks that the ordinary sense of time is the sense of an absolute simultaneity, so that I can say something's happening here and now, and I can ask what's happening in Paris here and now. And then he says, this notion is violated by the theory of Einstein of special relativity, so that when there's quote-unquote gravity, but gravity is a technical term, it doesn't mean what it means in ordinary life, primarily, because in other words, gravity used to be said of things falling or things being heavy somehow, and then you need a scientific correction to say it's not really about things being heavy, because there's this correction you have to make based on what kind of situation you're in, and that the mass is the actual issue. But then it goes even further and further and further away from the ordinary sense of what's meant by gravity, until it means actually almost the same thing as any situation where there's an acceleration effect. So that gravity becomes redefined as acceleration, which is not a normal term of human life, the way it's used to make calculations in physics. Even if we have a normal sense of acceleration, which overlaps with it in some sense. Einstein's sense of relativity is to connect motion and define time as a motion effect, so that 1 second elapses at the rate of 1 second, which is sort of stupid to say, but it's like rather than something going a mile in 1 second, and then you could say like the acceleration, you could give an acceleration rate in terms of both the time and the distance from 0 to 60 and whatever. But if you're just talking about the time, then 1 second passes at the rate of 1 second. But this 1 second is defined by some kind of physical system. So it remains the sort of like the one of the 1 second, which could also be given as, so many milliseconds or something. If you want, you could put any number you want on it, define it any way you want, because you could split it up any way you want. But it ultimately refers to some physical occurrence. And then, so like time is already being predefined in physics as a physical occurrence in a sort of where one system is being compared to another. How many decays of the cesium, how much is happening in this cesium atom by comparison to something else. How many times does the cesium atom break down in some respect by comparison to how many to some physical system, which is, as it were, an accidental system, such as the turning of the Earth around its rotation, which won't be eternal. Yeah, from this perspective, then you say there's not a absolute simultaneity, but this totally misses the question of time as a now rather than a before or later. But time as a now is simply yet another sort of box, a box view of things, an identity view of things. Time as a now is then what Aristotle understood. So time as a now means there's a time as a now wherever you go, but there's also before it and a later relative to that time as a now. And so then you can think of a sun clock or whatever. But to say there's a time as a now is a totally independent thought of saying there's time as simultaneity, where you can ask what was where you can say what was happening somewhere else now. This is two thoughts which could be discerned separately, and which don't necessarily imply the other. So there's still time as a now for the in, let's say, the world as it actually is according to the experiments. And the fact that the now for technical calculation doesn't happen at the same time. So it's like, meaning if the times were greater, or if our powers were greater, you could imagine a situation where the things that, according to a certain frame of reference, happened later could be controlled by the things that, according to a certain frame of reference, happened earlier, because it's all a mechanical system. And the question of time as the so-called now point doesn't really come in. You could experience, in other words, there could be time as a now in the thing that happened later and the thing that happened earlier. There is, but it's only, we say, later or earlier from a certain perspective, such as we judge, for instance, from the time of the birth of Christ and rename it as the time of the Common Era. It could be called by different names, but we judge historical time that way in the West. Of course, Islam starts at a different date, in the 600s, and Judaism goes back thousands of years to start for its start date, to its orientation point. Now, there's another step beyond this, which is, so like you have the Aristotelian sense, which doesn't imply the whole technical apparatus of the notion of the modern physics, which just talks about that there may be, so like Aristotle says, there may be a difference here between change or motion and time. Change and time may be different things, Aristotle says, but they seem to be closely related. But you could do another type of analysis where you don't accept that time must be considered in terms of now, before, after. in a kind of essentializing way. You could introduce metaphors and metonymies on top of that, which then could become common sense. So the common sense is mobile. Because it would be, you would see that when you grew up, you would just sense that older people thought that way. And when you went to school, you would explicitly be indoctrinated into it. So there'd be nothing else. Unless you say there's some sort of in a, I think it was Piaget that did this experiment, so not sure. That posited that many things that we think are straightforwardly part of the world aren't necessary to accept either mathematically, nor are they accepted by small children who haven't learned one way of doing it or another. So like in topology, the notion of inside and outside isn't so fixed. Now, the notion of essentializing the idea of now, like in this Eckhart Tolle sense of I think one of his books is something about the now. I can't remember the title, but this is one of the ways of talking he has quite commonly, and it sort of overlaps with what's shown, as it were, what we're led to be made to see in a certain manner in, I think his name is Rupert Spira, says some YouTube's on it. This notion of a now, which basically I think is in the direction of what Aristotle's thinking. It's more like saying there's fire in Athens as there is in Rome. There's also nowness as it is in Athens as it is in Rome. It doesn't imply this simultaneity or the whole big machined version of the galaxy or whatever, or of the so-called natural cosmos. It's just like nowness is some kind of soup that people are in almost. But then the question remains sort of like whether nowness can be investigated more directly. So in sort of ways like Heidegger sometimes says things like it's analogous, or sort of there's a metaphor on the painter's way of talking of foreground, middle ground, and background. So it strikes one in that, like, if you're actually talking about a painting or a film, there's something there. There's something the painting or the film doesn't show. And one part of it is just one thing. But one could probably find infinite number of things, including the way sort of language operates and tells us how to think about it, is the foreground, middle ground, and background, which then clearly it's like thinking about a painting, none of them are actually closer to us or further from us. The foreground, the middle ground, and the background are objectively, from the point of view of somebody looking at a painting in a gallery, they're all at the same distance. So it's a matter of understanding in terms of something we already bring with us that tells us like this is the way to understand a spatial situation. Is there something like that more basic that could then replace the notion that has become so powerful through the Aristotelian teaching and was not common sense to the Athenians? And of course, one can show in many cases, like the newer people, as Evans Pritchard has shown, didn't even have the concept of time. So that, I mean, the notion of a simultaneity in a gigantic mechanical system, which comprises everything connected to the Big Bang, if that's supposed to be, I mean, in the version where the Big Bang is the only deployment of mass into space. Yeah, this whole conception of a machine version obviously is more advanced, but even the notion just like there's something happening here now, what's happening right now somewhere else, it remains untheoretical. Even if people did talk like that, it remains hazy. Like because were they actually talking about like they were thinking about something specific? Like what are they doing there? I don't know. Like what are they doing in Rome right now? If it's like something somebody's actually concerned about, like an army is being amassed or something, and do we have time to counter it or whatever? It's seems quite different than just the dreamy, speculative. Oh, what's happening now in the North Pole or something, or on the moon? I think already you need some like rope to be let out. You already need something to hang yourself with before you get over to this more theoretical view of the simultaneity. And it doesn't even necessarily, even just the sort of dreamy kind of, the notion that time is just putting those ideas together isn't there just because you have somebody saying what's happening now in some other city. It's somehow it doesn't need to be built up that way or taken that way as a concern, and an investigation into, I mean, taken this way, we get this sort of hard problem where the 1 of the 1 second stands outside the whole system as part of this old metaphysical apparatus of Aristotle's laws of thought. So that just as you have the law of identity and non-contradiction, you have quality and quantity, and then you have this number, and there's sort of like a symptom of everything that exists is number all of a sudden, corresponding to episteme. But is that actually true? Do we actually have to accept that? It doesn't seem. Obviously we don't, because like lots of people don't, and lots of times in our own thoughts we don't, and we feel free in our own thoughts not to. But then the question becomes more like, is it better to accept it? Like, is this the thing we should be training ourselves to think this way, and training young people to think this way in the schools and in the universities? There's a double question there, because it's one, there's a whole discussion with the has a word, the public, and what the public considers um, to make immediate sense, and what's allowed in terms of thinking about it. But then there's also this question of whether there's a religious question of like, oh, you have to say this, otherwise something's it's as though you were admitting to a crime or something, which one wouldn't do in usual cases. I mean, a just person would do so if there was a sense to it, but in general, I think when one has, I mean, murderers don't usually just commit to unless something like Poe's Telltale Heart or something, they go crazy. But usually murderers will prefer to lie, and then in a certain way, one considers it common sense that they'll do so. But it amounts to the same thing with a lot of these epistemological questions. Because there's told one simply can't think about it that way, and it wouldn't be at all. To think about it that way would be immoral, basically. So there's some of that pressure is involved, I think, when we try to think with Heidegger, where he's not staying with Aristotle. So I'll just end this way by mentioning, as I always do, is that people that think that being in time tells us about Heidegger are extremely misled, because this book, as Thomas Sheehan brings out in his version after 50 years of studying Heidegger, is a tripartite deconstruction of Aristotle, of Descartes, of Kant. So when we get this, we don't, all the other 99 works of Heidegger, we don't get a lot of talk about the transcendental. But only because we're deconstructing Kant and being in time, we happen to get some talk about this type of questions. There's no question of access, by the way, also in Heidegger. This is another thing that's people that are still obsessed with the notion of a subject that needs access through consciousness and so on, talk about in Heidegger. Because Heidegger demonstrates how this notion of subject, access, and consciousness, unconsciousness were developed historically, and it didn't exist for earlier form of investigation into these matters, and that the edification or building up to them is can be deconstructed, or which is to say, they can be we could face up to them and ask whether they genuinely make sense, whether they've become idols, which people through their immense power of idols in daily life and in political life have over life and death. Naturally, the scholars too get into this heavy gravity, even if they're but most of the time I think the scholar will say something, but then the books will be traduced or just be rubbished by the powers of liberal capitalism.